Hi Paul, how are you? Hello, welcome to SVA and to the Department of Design, Writing, Research and Criticism, or Research, Writing and Criticism, interchangeable order, of course. Just a couple of announcements before we introduce our speaker tonight. Definitely let people know we're still accepting applications for the program. So lots of information on our website. Follow us on Twitter. Check out videos of previous lectures that you may have missed. They're also logged on our website. And mark your calendars for this exhibition, which is coming up on May 13th, called Exploding Footnotes, which is going to showcase the research process that lies behind the thesis work of our students, kind of really putting what's normally hidden at the bottom of the page into the spotlight. So we're having a lot of fun putting that together. Also, we have a 2-week summer intensive coming up June 1st to the 12th, and we also have a couple more spots left in that if people are interested in a kind of taster course of the program, I suppose, with some fabulous faculty members, great field trips, and deep immersion into the archive. This is our second lecture this week, actually. We're packing them in, and we've got one more on Tuesday before the end of the semester. So if you want to come along for that, I think there are still some spaces. But right now, I'm very happy to be introducing our speaker, Michael J. Golec, who is here to discuss the revival of French humanist 16th-century typography in the machine age of 1930s America. So here in the department, we don't normally deal with such large spans of time in our consideration of design history. So I'm really looking forward to Michael's analysis of this particular typographic revival, as well as his thoughts on some larger historical issues, such as survival, memory, nostalgia, reinvention, reproduction, and anachronism, all of which kind of figure in this work. So apart from the new light such concepts can shed on our dealings with chronology and its discontinuities, they might also provide models for our consideration of contemporary and future design practice, as the time-based nature of design becomes increasingly significant. And I'm really noticing this at the moment. I mean, it's always been an interest of mine, but I just had 2 announcements for design, symposio, or the one on memory and the second one on anticipation. So really engaging with this notion of time at the moment. And it's definitely been of interest here in the department, where students have investigated, or are investigating, sustainability in fashion design education, the need for repairability to be built into products, decay as a condition and as a salutary counterforce to the box-fresh image of design, as well as other studies of design piracy, burial containers, personal memorializing objects, urban exploration, post-occupancy critique, preservation, and more, all of within which time plays a very central role. So anyway, if we want to find such future-focused ideas in nuanced historical inquiry, we're definitely in the right hands tonight. Michael J. Golec is Associate Professor of Art and Design History at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He was the 2011 Anschutz Distinguished Fellow in American Studies at Princeton. He's published a bunch of articles in Journal of Design History, Design Issues, where he was a reviews editor as well, History and Technology, Home Cultures, as well as being the associate editor of Design and Culture. Michael is the author of Brillo Box Archive, Aesthetics, Design and Art, which came out in 2008, and the co-editor of the 2009 book, Relearning from Las Vegas, another engagement with time. His research and teaching focuses on theories and histories of graphic visualization, technical images, and typography. He's currently working on 2 book-length projects, which we can talk about. If you don't cover now, we can talk about in the Q&A. But basically, his aim is to bring theories of visuality and methods of art historical research to bear on histories of non-art image making. I seek to bring him to the podium, so please welcome Michael J. Golec.
Thank you so much, Alice, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. I also want to thank Emily Weiner for her help in arranging my visit. I come to this topic this evening, or the one that I'll present this evening, as a historian who teaches the history of design in an institution that's largely made up of students who are primarily interested in the contemporary. So I'm always an anachronism in their minds. I supervise grad students and teach grad level seminars in the history of design, and the material that I research generally falls within the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, and most recently in the 1930s. Amazingly, the vast majority of my students consider what I work on to be ancient history. And again, I'm speaking of graduate students who attend my school to become historians, oddly enough. Fortunately, my seminars are always well populated with smart and ambitious young students, scholars, and critics. And I chalk this up not to me, but to the fact that they have to take one late 19th century seminar and one early 20th century seminar. So it's all set up for me. When I teach seminars in my area of research, participants contribute all kinds and all manner of wildly diverse and penetrating insights, most of which a conventional historian would find and consider them to be ahistorical at best or sheer nonsense at worst. When I first began teaching, I was inclined to carefully consider ahistorical comments with respect for the sincerity of the students who, despite their focus on contemporary issues, were trying to make sense of history as it relates to their moment. Sticking to this strategy, I'm continually challenged by discussions that are brimming with anachronisms, and I'm pleased to say students have taught me to pursue anachronistic juxtapositions of my own, hence the title of my talk for this evening, Champ Fleury in the Machine Age. The difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. I begin with this thought and this image of an intervention in the continuum of the history of typography in the United States. If the typographic work of revival as an awareness of the past and as its translation fails to impart something of the original's time-bound nature, that is, of the past or of its pastness as difference, then the representation of original work does something other than preserve the past. In the revived form, there remains something in excess of past time, which is something of an awareness of a temporal dimension out of joint with the past and the present as instances of temporal disorientation. Revival reveals what of the past survives in the present as disproportionate to mere historicization. That is to say, a revival does not make history, rather it makes a present. Considered from this perspective, revival turns out to be survival, and thus the term. A shift from revival to survival constitutes an awakening to the transmissions of what itself cannot show as withdrawn, but as already present. Survival has a particular, even peculiar meaning in the history or historiography of typography in the United States. The term occupies a significant place in the subtitle of Daniel Berkeley Updike's Printing Types, Their History, Forms, and Use, a study of survivals from 1922. Updike used survival in its evolutionary sense. He wrote, quote, as in the Roman alphabet, as opposed to other alphabets, as in certain famous types, as opposed to other types, meaning non-famous or bad maybe, we see a survival of the fittest, end quote. The evolutionary thrust of Updike's statement resonated with biological, social, and political ideologies of his era, most notably those that defended continuous models of time. His use of survival of the fittest hewed closer to Herbert Spencer's theory of social evolution, intended to maintain the hegemony of the ruling class, than it did to Darwin's theory of the biological evolution of species. And the expression was survival of the fittest was Spencer's, which Darwin added in the 5th edition of the Origins. So it never really did originate with Darwin, survival of the fittest. For his readers, the clue to Updike's Spencerian sense of survival was nestled in his offhand comment, these are his words, apparently it was not so much conditions as personality and education that produced the fine books of early days. For Updike, typography was only good when practiced patiently by educated men of trained taste. Rather than the instrumentalism of evolutionary histories of typography and all the baggage that accompanied its implicit and very often explicit attacks on degeneracy of form, survival was also understood as a symptom of temporal disorientation along the lines of the 19th century British anthropologist Edward B. Tylor, who made famous, in anthropology at least, the idea of the vertiginous play of time in the present. It is the same sense of survival, the vertiginous play of time in an exchange between two objects, that I'd like to take up this evening. The object I want to bring into contact, or the objects that I want to bring into contact with each other this evening, are two specimens of typography. Geoffroy Tory's Champ Fleury, first printed in 1529, was a product of the French Renaissance. And the second object, the Grolier Club translation of Tory's book, designed by Bruce Rogers in 1927, was itself a product of the machine age. By attempting to bridge a gap between these two historical objects, I want to know what survived of the Tory edition in the machine age, and how can an examination, albeit brief, of the Champ Fleury in the machine age, that is the Grolier edition, reveal something of early modern printing in France. Importantly, the machine age can be understood as the final stage in the social and cultural assimilation of mechanization. It is the culmination of a history of techniques as an internal and external disciplining force in human worlds. Accordingly, in the early 20th century, the machine was no longer merely a labor-saving tool for achieving old ends, but was then embraced as an effective way of actively materializing new values. So it's important to note from this attitude towards progress that the machine embodied the spirit of the age. The printing press, one should note, and typography played a significant role in attaining this final stage. Therefore, the printed page was considered to be a product of mechanical reproduction that expressed the ideological demands of a machine age. And I think that this cover and spread from machine art exemplifies something of this spirit, both in terms of the exhibition and in terms of the catalog itself. In terms of typography and graphic design, it was a turn to the machine that inspired Douglas C. McMurtry to author Modern Typography and Layout from 1929, The Fundamentals of Modernism in Typography from 1930, Structure in the New Typography, also 1930, and Active Age Typography, also 1930. Moved by the galvanizing presence of European new typography, McMurtry was careful to advocate for an American modernism in keeping with the nation's unique machine aesthetic. The goal, as he saw it, was to express, in his words, a modern spirit distinct from the dogmas of European new typography and its mental attitude. In keeping with early 20th century discourses on economies of perception, McMurtry also advised, quote, to grasp the essence of the modern spirit is something like trying to make a close-up snapshot of a racing automobile, end quote, or of a racing train. graphic designers in the early century took cues from the psychology of perception to produce layouts that were tools for effective selling. And this comparison on your right from Jim Clark shows that distinction between a kind of pre-new typography-inspired, more traditionalist approach to layout to the more streamlined or mechanized version on the left. Studies in applied psychology to effective design observed the advantage of asymmetrical layout and the use of lowercase letters, in addition to the study of line length, letter spacing, and point size. One, if not the critical aspect of machine age, dictates was the commodification of attention in the age of distraction, or what's been referred to as moment-by-moment multiple focus, as a performance of distributed attentiveness. This is something similar to what Freud called evenly suspended attention in the context of modern psychoanalysis, a kind of distracted attentiveness, a way of sort of seeing everything, but only focusing on things that were most important. Because modernism made the problem of attention a key issue, modern distraction required the establishment of a training in attentive norms and practices of focus. Thus, there arose a discourse on what kind of attention should be encouraged as a response to the rise of mass consumption and the related social and economic shifts in the 1920s and 1930s. The solution in typography was in keeping with the dynamic of the machine age and of modern experience itself. Modernists advocated for a newly conceived subject who could allow her attention to roam, selecting useful information from across a range of graphical media. Typography delivered information, a mere resource within the framework of technological modernity. Indeed, as Marshall McLuhan pointedly observed, quote, "The invention of typography confirmed and extended the new visual stress of applied knowledge, providing the first uniformly repeatable commodity, the first assembly line, and the first mass production," end quote. In this sense, attention, too, was a repeatable commodity, relentlessly inscribed as active visuality. Much like the machine age in general, machine age typography was understood as the final stage in the social and cultural assimilation of attention and focus. Worried about surrendering the humanistic essence of typography to the machine, so-called traditionalists such as Thomas M. Cleland, Updike, and Rogers advocated for a self-effacing approach to typographic design. As Megan Benton has argued, calls for the rescue of typography's classical heritage were symptomatic of the struggle between humanistic and industrial values. The latter was exemplified in the rhetoric of the new typography and its claims for the social value of a machine-defined character of the printed page. In response, traditionalists guarded against a mindless capitulation to the machine, fearing that the essential spirit of humanism was at stake. In the age of the machine, traditionalists looked to pre-industrial, early modern examples of good form. Instead of embracing a machine age aesthetic, good typography should function as an escape from the fast-paced modern world. It should not remind the reader of contemporary instabilities. According to Benton, traditionalists argue that the book should function as a palliative for the shock effects of modern life. This is not to say, however, that traditional typography was by any means merely a slavish aping of historical models. And there are many examples, but I'm showing you Cleland's attempts at ennobling or humanizing industrialization through these advertisements for General Motors. In the last century, modernist typography, new typography, or machine age typography introduced an advanced set of standardized forms, seemingly averse to the typographic vocabulary inspired by the classical tradition. it could be argued the Grolier Club edition of the Champ Fleury was a troublesome artifact that thwarted typography's appropriation to machine-age aesthetic. Or as I argue, the revivalist strategy may not have been simply a rejection of machine-age typography, but most likely was a tacit disclosure or revelation that humanism itself had long been beset by the machine and its accompanying perceptual training. Following McLuhan, the machine age of the early 20th century possessed no privileged claim on the commodification of attention. And it is this observation that directs us to the question of survival. Imagine the following fragments as they relate to typography in general. Montage of spacing, the destabilization of the semantic elements of the text, the visual shift in the montage of words, a convergence and dispersal of typographic invagination by which the spatial play of letters perform what is forbidden in the narrative. And finally, a play of vertical montage and dispersion. From the, everyone's got that? Should I repeat those? Sorry. You get the picture. From this array of descriptions, you might think that I'm quoting from a book like Joanna Drucker's invaluable text, The Visible Word, Experimental Typography and Modern Art, 1909 to 1923, with reference to her post-structural pairing of Jacques Derrida with El Lissitzky or Marinetti. In truth, I quote from Tom Connolly's equally influential history, The Graphic Unconscious of Early Modern French Writing. In his book, Connolly has observed that early modern typography possessed, in his words, a penchant for movement and was spotted with typographic junctures to which its picto-vertical allegory or its role as hieroglyph conjoined visible forms to invisible structure. The graphic unconscious indicates where typography did not transcribe clear intention into print, but used the virtues of the letter to multiply, betray, and redirect avenues of meaning. Nowhere was the dynamic of typographic montage more apparent than in the Champ Fleury's new, and I put that in quotes, typography, that is the old new typography. You thought there was just one new typography? There's two. A book that Connolly has referenced repeatedly in his examination of French Renaissance literary production. You'll have to excuse me for 1 second. This image is slightly disproportionate to its actual size compared to the Grolier Champ Fleury. The Tory Champ Fleury is really a precious little thing. It's really quite lovely. In fact, so this looks gigantic. My apologies. I've monumentalized it, maybe unconsciously because it's played such a huge part in my dream life over the past couple weeks preparing for this lecture. The Latinist philosopher and philologist Geoffroy Tory wrote, designed, and printed one of the most influential books ever published in French. In addition to standardizing the use of Roman type in French printing, Tory's Champ Fleury was distinguished as the inaugural attempt to grapple with serious problems in French orthography and grammar. With the goal of linguistic normalization, his greatest concern was with damage done by the corruptors and debasers of the French language. And I should just remark very briefly, Ives, who translates the Grolier edition, it goes nuts with trying to translate Tory Champ Fleury. It makes no sense to him at all. He consults multiple, as he says in his letters, 16th century French dictionaries and can find none. So much for normalizing, right? The moment he normalizes French language, it becomes obsolete, and Ives can't find any reference to it. Ironic. In addition to, Tory's Champ Fleury was distinguished as the inaugural attempt to grapple with serious problems in French orthography and grammar. With the goal of linguistic normalization, his greatest concern was with damage, blah, blah, blah. Tory divided the text into 3 sections, or books, respectively concerned with, in book 1, The use and order of French language following a rule of elegance. In Book 2, a treatise on the invention of letters, their shapes and proportions. And in Book 3, the spelling of words and their ordering in sentences. Any consideration of humanism and the techniques of culture is bound to lead to reflect on the prestige of the alphabet. And so, for typographers and printers, the formal qualities of Tory's letters were of great interest, as was the founding and finding of the letters in, quote, sacred body. In this, Tory proposed the cardinal form of the letter by establishing a shallow recessional order of space within the limits of a grid system. As such, Tory displayed an acute awareness of the humanistic dimensions of the letter as if to register the bodily condition of the reader. The grid, however, dictated much of the proportions of the letter, with the image of the male human body too confined to the rule of geometry. Tory aimed for the clarity and conscious simplicity in orthography, but he may not have achieved the same outcome in typography. Indeed, it would take Bruce Rogers in the early 20th century to design a Champ Fleury that embodied clarity and conscious simplicity in typography. And here, I should remark that his achievement was a departure from the original, and I'll say more about this later. But returning to these two pages for the moment, let's return to the complexity of Tory's edition. Across a two-page spread, 4 large capitals jostle for the attention of the reader. There are 2 large letters on each page, stacked one above the other. Their asymmetrical staggered placement marks attention across the 2 pages, indicating a verticality that challenges the just horizontal landscape-like orientation of the open book. O-A-H-K, H-O-K-A, A-H-O-K-A, K-O-H-A. Letter forms solicit the eye to skip through various sequences of typographic arrangement and thus reinforce the montage-like effect of the overall composition. Contained within a grid-like frame with 2 diagonal lines crossing to mark a center point, the large capital O touches off the diagonal crisscrossing scanning of the pages. The overall saccadic rhythm is further reinforced by the 3 circles that occupy the grids that underlay A, H, K. The letter O echoes in the circles that register the spread eagle figure that occupies the bowl of the letter forms. The first diagonal gutter margin, crossing where O cuts to K, cuts to H, cuts to A, inspires a calisthenic-like movement. As Tory remarks in regards to the cardinality of the letter O, quote, liberal arts are more concerned with bodily exercise. Thus, the human figure performs a Renaissance version of jumping jacks. Here, motion animates the 2 pages, infusing the layout with a vitality that is wholly typographic. In this sense, the typographic machine transforms the printed page into an animated surface, one that performs bodily exercise. While Tory's letter forms are, as Francis Thibodeau observed, of an inimitable purity of form and unsurpassed elegance, the layout of the Champ Fleury exhibits something unsettling for the humanist character of print in the 16th century French. Words and images are just barely contained by the framework of the printing press, and following avenues of meaning required that the early modern reader take up an attitude in kind with the much later modern attitude of moment-by-moment multiple focus. Attention flits about the elegance of the drawn Roman capitals, their shallow recession pushing perception in various directions across the pages of the 16th century book. Attention skips across the surface at each turn of the page, projecting movement throughout the entire book. Remarkably, very little of what I've just described registers with the Grolier edition of the Champ Fleury. As Frederick Ward observed of the then work in progress on the Champ Fleury, actually beginning in 1915, officially approved by the Grolier Club in 1922, finally published in 27, but not distributed till 1928. Ward observes, "It may be contended that Mr. Rogers has never designed a book which can be called in toto 16th century, that is, one in which all the typographic elements are inspired by the best work of that single epoch." Indeed, Rogers' designs provided some perspective on, and thereby distance from, the past. But as I will explain, not too much of either. Already, Rogers had made his mark on American typography before he attended to the production of the Grolier edition of the Champ Fleury. Since graduating from Purdue University in 1890, he worked in the tradition of the Kelmscott Press, best exemplified by Gruel's Notes, Critical and Biographical from 1895, Modern Art, several editions published by Prang and Company, and a series of books for the Riverside Press. After the turn of the century and his departure from Riverside Press, Rogers put aside the neo-Gothicism of the Kelmscott influence and took up early modern printing as a source of inspiration. Indeed, as many of his admirers have recounted, the 16th century guided Rogers to achieve the apex of traditionalist American typography in the early 20th century. As Beatrice Ward recounted, quote, "It is not too much to say that but for the experiments of Mr. Bruce Rogers, we should still be under the dominion of black type and heavy woodcut decorations." Like Tory before him, Rogers turned away from the Gothic in his mature work to establish a future for fine printing in the United States. In 1909, Rogers designed the George B. Ives translation of Auguste Bernard's Geoffroy Tory, which originally was published in French in 1865, which was then the most comprehensive study of the French figure to date. Here, he became intimately familiar with Tory's works by redrawing the original cuts from photographs to correct the blemishes of over-inking, poor presswork, or damage that resulted from the original impression. He remarked, that is, Rogers remarked, "Notwithstanding some inevitable slight divergences of the line, this method of redrawing from photographs preserves the far greater faithfulness as spirit and effect of the original prints, and the result is more truly a facsimile than a direct photographic copy would have been." Also, because the book was a translation from Bernard's French to Ives' English, Rogers had to reset the entire book. And again, because the original type had suffered from over-inking and other mishaps, he composed the book in Centaur, a font that began as Rogers' adaptation of Jensen for the Riverside Press's monumental publication of the 3 folio volumes of essays by Montaigne between 1902 and 1904. The overall result was, as Frederick Ward reported, a restoration of Tory's typographic works to the state that the French master, quote, "would have wished them to appear," end quote. It was this manner of preservation treatment, a hybrid of hand and machine correction that provided perspective and distance, that eventually would make its way into Rogers' Grolier edition of the Champ Fleury. Admittedly, adjustments had to be made when Rogers approached the design of the Grolier edition. There was no way around the fact that the Grolier edition was a translation. Thus, the flow of the text in English could not conform to that of the original French text. And even in the case of Ives' conversion of French into English, one could hardly expect an exact copy of Tory's book. To the modern American reader, even the members of the Grolier Club, the style of the original may have faded over time and would have been perceived as out of touch with contemporary concerns. And Ives actually talks about this in terms of the translation. He decides not to translate it into the English of the 16th century, but translates it into the English of the early 20th century. At the very least, Rogers had to allow for the difference in the material conditions of print technology. of the early 20th century. To seek the essence of such changes, as Walter Benjamin once observed of translation, as well as the equally constant changes in meaning and the subjectivity of posterity rather than the very life of language and its works, would mean to confuse the root cause of a thing with its essence. An attempt at likeness, or word for word in translation, would have denied the most powerful and fruitful historical processes, of which the goal was to locate kinship without having to resort to an exact reproduction. The task at hand for both Ives and Rogers was to locate the intended effect of language and its material manifestation as typography, from which the translation produces in the echo of the original. It was an echo that sounded the afterlife of the Champ Fleury in the machine age. What survived of the Renaissance book with its orthotypographic prescriptions were made present only in confrontation with its machine age edition. The fact of the Champ Fleury did not reside in either Tory's or Rogers' works, but was apparent as an echo, a play between the two editions. What then were the distinctions, the products of the tasks of both the linguistic and typographic translators that were available for close scrutiny? And how might an inscription of difference across the page have notified the early 20th century American reader to a critique of an economy of perception in the machine age? Again, this was a reactionary critique that Benton has attributed to the so-called traditionalists, the nature of which may have been fraught with complexities yet to be disclosed. The directly comparable two-page spread in the Grolier Champ Fleury displays four large capitals settled within columns of type. They do not jostle for the attention of the reader. Instead, the placement of Roman letters distribute perception evenly across two pages. Each letter is stacked one above the other. Their balanced placement marks an even play across the spread, inscribing a stable and squared configuration. O-H-H-K, H-O-K-A, A-H-O-K, K-O-H-A. Letter forms fall into a sequence of typographic arrangement and thus reinforce the subdued effect of composition. The design of the Grolier edition serves to highlight a request for modesty in the original. In the case of Tory's edition, the large capital O touches off the diagonal crisscross scanning of the pages. In the Grolier edition, however, Rogers' stabilization of the layout draws attention downward, thereby directing the reader to the chaste figure whose, in Tory's words, organ of generation, as Tory described his little man, is obscured by the crossbar of the letter A. Rather than the all-over saccadic rhythm elicited by Tory's Champ Fleury, the Grolier edition constructs the deep-focused continuity of reading sought for by the traditionalists. The once animated page, a vitality that's wholly typographic, as I mentioned earlier, is frozen into an image of control, of clear directionality, and of attention that was nowhere present in the early modern book. This is in contrast to the all-over montage effect of Tory's layout as first discussed in Conley. Rogers' design revealed to the early 20th century reader the extent to which Tory had disassembled cardinality and virtuality of the page as compositional techniques intended to draw his reader into the text. If, as Frederick Kittler has argued, pictoriality was the goal of the printing press, as the inscription of a recessional order of space seen in the page, then Tory's compositions rejected pictoriality and recession for the all-overness of typographic surface. Furthermore, Rogers' typographic treatment suppressed the moment-by-moment multiple focus of Tory's Champ Fleury in his redesign of the Grolier edition. Why? Perhaps as an attempt to further situate the past as a critique of the present invocations of the machine in print. Or maybe it was an attempt to reformat and thereby refocus the commodification of perception. In cleaning up the historical model, Rogers asserted an idealized singularity over the historical reality of multiplicity by denying the early modern edition of the Champ Fleury's prefiguration of the late modern moment-by-moment multiple focus. Such a denial has two implications that I can only briefly outline tonight. On the one hand, following Benton's argument, Rogers' denial of Tory's old new typography was in service to the traditionalist ideological critique of machine-age typography. Here, Benton has observed an anxiety over the perceived erosion of attention or deep focus in modernist typography and design. Literacy and reading were thought to be at the very core of the communicative function of humanism, which was underwritten by the medium of the press. The traditionalist understood that typography should enhance the continuity of reading, as in the rhetoric of the crystal goblet, and opposed the thingness of type. The result was an emphasis on singularity, solitude, and the communion of one with the page. Advocating for a reader's prolonged encounter with a text was in direct opposition to the perceived promiscuity of machine-age typography and its adherence to the dictates of vulgar capitalism. Machine-age typography celebrated multiplicity, sociability, and the communion of the masses. The understanding of the humanist book and its call to stay with the text as a way of gaining access to the thought and the presence of the author was additionally an invitation to a gathering of like-minded, attentive readers who were regarded as educated men possessing good taste. The traditionalist advocated for the singularity of the elite, and the traditionalist version of humanist typography encouraged a staying with the text and a gathering of readers, as both were expressed in Updike's concept of survival, which I described earlier. On the other hand, Tory's Champ Fleury, as a specimen of the ideal humanist text, never really existed, nor did the early modern book advocate for singularity of any sort. That is, the humanist book was never humanistic in the way that traditionalists thought it was. As Conley, Desarteau, and Chartier have asserted, early modern books possess nothing of the singular and stable qualities that could have sustained deep focus or the continuity of reading. Tory's design invited movement and dispersal. Its qualities were of a different sort than those qualities championed by the early 20th century traditionalists. So it seems hardly controversial to propose that Tory's edition was as promiscuous as any machine-age magazine or advertisement in its dynamic layout and typography. It too was designed to keep pace with the movement of early modern life and embodied the moment-by-moment multiple focus of its time. While Tory certainly intended the book to be read, he also meant it to be scanned for snippets of information in keeping with early modern typography's penchant for movement. So contrary to the traditionalist impression that sustained attentiveness was a constituent element of the humanist subject, the habit formation of a particular kind of distributed attention had been forged long before the 20th century and the commodification of perception. Eye habit, as McMurtry once referred to the physiology of perception, does not easily change. Quote, to achieve the clear voice legibility demanded by the new typography, the first new is mine, calls for renewed attention to well-known principles which have not and will not change. In an instance of anachronic reverse engineering, the old new typography persisted where one might least expect. The eye habit that followed early modern typography survived in modernist typography and not in traditionalist revivals of the early 20th century. In this sense, the rhythms of a material past were driven into the present of the late 1920s. This is the weird reality of anachronism, where, for example, the montage of alliteration and of spacing in Joseph Alber's cover for the MoMA Machine Age catalog from 1934 registered the influence of Tory's edition of the Champ Fleury. As in Champ Fleury, so too in machine art. A shape can open up a cleft in a space. ART, art, and ART, a cleft in art, showed trouble in typographic alliteration. Space reinserted the asymmetrical into a symmetrical layout, cracking open its classical-leaning composition. A shared spatial material disorientation, the eye habit of the early modern and the modern prods us to confront survival as temporal disorientation. So in conclusion, following the logic of radical decontextualization in its transposition of two objects from distant times and places, results from the removal of each example from their exalted place of context, where they are allowed to withdraw in historicity. This deposition does not reduce each example to the history of the other, nor does it eliminate history altogether. Rather, it treats history as the survival of difference, where difference is a condition of possibility for meaning. The historical meaning, rather than the contextual meaning of Tory's edition, can be registered in relation to the machine art catalog and vice versa, as much as it can be in relation to its more reasonable counterpart, the Grolier edition of the Champ Fleury. This is what I meant earlier when I mentioned that anachronism can be construed as an awakening to transmissions of what itself cannot show as withdrawn, but always already present. The awareness of what survives as withdrawn relies on the spasm of anachronism, as I hope I've demonstrated this evening. Thank you. I didn't go too far over time.
That's great. No, it's perfect. And fascinating. Can you join me for some questions?
Thanks.
Really incredibly illuminating, very close study of an object in a way we've been.
Sorry.
In a way we've been encouraging the students to do. So I hope they're all taking note of that. It's fantastic. Now, I suppose it's a personal interest of mine. I want to start off with. I studied design history at a time when everyone was very, very interested in consumption of the object. You know, how an object was used and read and interpreted, and that's notoriously difficult to research.
Yes.
As it turns out.
Absolutely.
And I thought your techniques for doing that were really, really interesting, and I wonder if you could talk us through that a little more. Firstly, it seems like it's also of importance to you to understand how something might have been used. And if, well, you're hesitating, perhaps it's not. But
maybe only its use in, I think you're right in this case.
Yeah.
I think there's no question that there is always a question in terms of reception theory or reception histories in terms of how something could have been used. And I think oftentimes the study of a kind of continuity of particular forms drives into a reception style history and a set of principles in which the reception is already pre-programmed. So the historian looks for, in the case of the traditionalists and the modernists, key existing issues that they can use to understand either the traditionalist as a traditionalist or a modernist as a modernist.
Right.
One of the things I'm most interested in is looking into a wider and more complex array of modern typography in the early 20th century. And the traditionalist isn't my term, and I don't particularly like it. It's Megan Benton's term. And for her, it really situates Updike, Rogers, Cleland, and the others within an already existing framework in which we don't have to do too much work to understand how their work would have been received, right? Because it's already sort of pre-programmed. Traditionalist, I get that. That's against modernist. And the modernist I know does this. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is complicate those issues of reception by using anachronism and survival as a way of asking maybe a different set of questions in terms of use.
It's a really interesting approach. Just to go a little further with that, I mean, quite literally, what would, who would have been using and how would they have been using the Grolier edition? What was it? How was it?
Well, in the Grolier Club would commission editions of existing historical texts. So Rogers designed a portion, or designed Durer's treatise on the alphabet prior to doing the Geoffroy Tory Champ Fleury. As I said, this had been originally, the book had been basically Theodore Devine suggested very early in the history of the Grolier Club in the late 19th century that someone should take on the project of a translation of the Champ Fleury and redesign it for the Grolier Club. In 1915, Cleland and H.W. Kent, who was then the assistant librarian at the Grolier Club, joined together with Bruce Rogers to make this happen. By 1922, it was approved.
Right.
Now, what happens in between is a number of things. World War I, there's a question of whether or not the Grolier, and this gets to your point, the Grolier Club members would subscribe. So the books were produced or were paid for through subscription of the members.
Yeah.
So roughly about 350 editions were produced of the 1927 Champ Fleury, and of those, approximately, I think 10, I'm just trying to remember offhand, 10 were produced with special bindings to be auctioned off, one kept for the club, as well as just general subscriptions. So the members were the primary audience. In correspondence, there's always a discussion in terms of when a new book is proposed, whether or not they could get the members to subscribe. And the subscriptions, I mean, they were wide and depended on what kind of grouping the members were, and it went up and down. So of course, coming into the Depression in the late 20s, I mean, there was lots of members in the late 20s, and by the 1930s there were not as many, couldn't afford to become members. And so that goes up and down, but primarily members.
A very specialist audience.
Yes.
Well, we've got some specialists in our audience tonight, so we should actually try and some questions from people. I'm sure people have them. Questions for Michael? Yeah, for Mike.
My first question.
Do you guys know each other, by the way?
We know each other through email, but now we know
We're
each
a nice
other
small
face to
group, so
face.
just introduce yourself before you.
I'm sorry, Paul Shaw. It's a simple question related to the one that Alice was asking. It occurred to me, why did the Grolier Club want to do the Champ Fleury in the first place, and why did Rogers want to do it? I mean, were they interested in French orthography and French language? I doubt it.
Well, I doubt it. That's true. I think as a really, Theodore Devine was really one of the guiding lights of the Grolier Club. And as a printer of well-renown, I think had set the tone for the possible production of that text. And so throughout the correspondence between the Committee for Publications, none that I can find, other than the observation that the introduction of these Roman types was historically significant in terms of a turn away and an absolute eventually the absolute turning away from the Gothic blackface or facture.
The focused on the type book was set in, but by the time Rogers worked on it, having done the Durer and later on the Caccioli, the emphasis must have been on constructive letters themselves.
From the Groliers?
Well, I think Rogers' interest
Yes,
be part of it.
that's right.
I mean, the whole point of doing the book was to show off these letters, really.
That's right. That's right. And you can see, for example, what's well, the other issue, of course, is that throughout the correspondence, Rogers does a mock-up of the book, a dummy of the book, or what he wants to propose in the early 20s. And that sort of gets the ball rolling. He says that he can't do, he doesn't think that there's probably enough interest from the club in doing the full Champ Fleury, so he does the Dur instead. And I think that's where you're right, Paul, that the idea of the construction of letters is much more important to Rogers himself. The members of the club, in terms of their reception, I can't say for sure.
I'm guessing they're very interested in the book that Rogers designed.
Absolutely. And I think you're right.
It's a book collector's club, or your club, yeah.
Sorry, the Grolier Club is a book collector's club.
Yeah,
I didn't say that. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Not always the content.
Well, and I think this is what's actually quite interesting about the correspondence between the Ives, the translator. He always expresses discontent because Rogers won't communicate with him in terms of the quality of the translation. And so I think there again, that sort of constitutes, I think what you're correctly saying, Paul, that the interest was in the construction of the of the faces.
I just wonder whether I'm not buying your whole idea about Tory and the whole way in which you read through the page.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
I think that Rogers made it more effective. I didn't say any difference because it's a book made in the 20th century with modern machinery.
Oh, there's no question.
And a whole different aesthetic about things being lined up properly.
That's right. That's right.
Produce them
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
But also, now looking at the other pages in the book, we don't really know what else is going on with the rest of the alphabet.
Oh no, I mean, I should say that that's right. I didn't show more pages of the book, but each page is directly, one could do a similar sort of comparison between the pages that do register in that way, where the alphabet is the focus. Again, the book is in 3 parts, and it's really the second book that focuses exclusively on the construction of letter forms.
You're not going to have that it's diagonal anywhere else.
Oh, well, I mean, there are other instances in which the O and the A and other forms are crucial to how Tory theorizes the construction of the proper form of the letter. And it's all in relationship to the human body. No surprise, that's a humanist sort of approach to the construction of anything. That's right, that's right.
Well, I'm going to let you guys finish that one. So let's move on. Two more questions. One is about your use of primary sources, because this is something we're all engaging with a lot. Just talk us through briefly what you've been using to develop this narrative.
Well, I'm not an early Renaissance scholar, so I've only worked with secondary sources.
Oh, you're talking about the correspondence at the...
No, I'm only with the actual Geoffroy Tory Champ Fleury.
Right.
The Grolier edition, I've used not only the archives at the Grolier Club in terms of correspondence about the production of the work, but also critics' reception of that work, both Ward's, Frederick, and Beatrice, and other individuals like Updike, who discuss Rogers' work overall, as well as correspondence between Stanley Morrison and Updike on Rogers and the production and the future production of the Champ Fleury. So I've used letters primarily. I do consider the Grolier Club edition itself as a primary source. My interest is often in terms of treating visual representation as a material artifact, and as that being the first primary source that's available. And so in that regard, I'm trying to exhaust as much of the primary resources that are available. I'm lucky to live in close proximity to the Newberry Library, which is another esteemed institution of the collection of books, one of the largest print collections in the United States. And so most of Rogers's works are in their collection. And so I've been able to consult those, as well as the original drawings for Centaur, Font, and other sources of Roger's own. Roger's material is dispersed widely. There's some at Purdue, there's some at Harvard, there's some at Library of Congress, there's some at the Grolier, there's some in Chicago at the Newberry.
And then just to draw you out on a more broader topic, I suppose, I wonder if you could make any comparisons between what you've been investigating historically for the role of printer publisher as a kind of cultural figure, and what we see sort of starting to happen today with not just the fetishization of books again, but really that kind of that sort of the powerful one perhaps of printer publisher rather than designer.
Publisher rather than designer. Right.
We're noticing just I think Lauren has been looking at the sort of new developments in arts publishing,
right.
Arts publishing, and this kind of the agency perhaps is better by than the power. But I saw some similarities and thought you could do some anachronistic historical.
Well, I think the interest for me is what we take as being something that was embedded in the historical past and take it up within our present, and what use that has either as critique or as reactionary or as some form of, I would say, enhanced agency, where our contemporary moment, the agency of our contemporary moment, is fueled by some reference from the past. And so revival becomes the general term used to consider those issues. So Morris's Kelmscott Press would have been the revival of Gothic, to some extent, Gothic typography. But the question for me is always what survives as a kind of destabilizing component within those moments of revival. And I'm quite taken with Tom Conley's book on the graphic unconscious, and I would recommend it to anyone interested in typography at all. Conley is a French Renaissance scholar of literature, but his work is really, I think, exemplary of the kind of work that I wish to do. And it's from Conley that I take the license of working out some of the anachronistic relationships. I should say also, Conley is also a great figure for me because he also works on the use of typography in early 20th century film. And so Conley, too, has this play between the literary history and cinematic history, and he treats both as media histories. I think one of the things, getting back to, I'm sort of going off point a little bit, but I think what I've heard recently from quite a few of my students is an interest in handcrafted typography as it is sort of celebrated in, I guess, hashtag handcrafted typography or some version of that, whatever that might be. And so, my question is always, what handcrafted typography would we be referring to exactly, and when was typography ever solely handcrafted? And so I would always sort of look for those elements that don't allow us to take, I think, as Bart would say, the myth of the hand into our present, but to question it through, in this particular case, though this isn't the only kind of methodology that I would advocate for anything, but by dealing with it, not in terms of context, but in terms of history. So you should tell me about your project later.
We can talk about it afterwards, but I think there is something similar going on about that, and also that looking outside of the current
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's what gets taken up, the understanding of the past as being remote from the present in such a way that it becomes a cure for present ills. I think this is mythologizing at its very core. And so my goal would be to sort of rethink those kinds of issues. It also would be the case that recently with parametric architecture, there's been quite an interest of the relationship of the digital in architecture and the Gothic. And people like Mario Carpo and others at Georgia State have been working out this relationship. And typography figures in there very importantly. A project that I probably won't work on, but is very open to being worked on. I thought I saw someone over here.
I think you sort of answered what I was going to ask, so thanks.
You've got wine next door and some snacks, so you could carry on. And,
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
But before we do that, please join me.
Tomorrow.
We'll debate later.
Please join me in thanking Michael.
Thanks, everyone.